Today marks the 7th day of the Delphi murders trial. Abby Williams and Libby German were murdered more than 7 years ago. This week, we hear from witnesses who saw Bridge Guy, believed to be the man captured on video by Libby German. We learned how police pulled that video from her phone with the infamous clip of what may be the killer's voice. We also learned that Richard Allen told police he was on the trail within days of the murders and cleared by police. And today we learned how investigators tied the so-called magic bullet found near Abby and Libby's bodies to a gun found in Richard Allen's home. Thanks for inviting us in. This is your Delphi debrief here on WTHR+. This was day 7 of the Delphi murders trial. In a moment, we'll hear from our legal expert, Katie Jackson-Lindsay. But first, our senior investigative reporter Bob Siegel and reporter Emily Longnecker are in Delphi for us. So Bob and Emily, walk us through this testimony today about this cartridge.
Yeah, today, Scott, jurors heard testimony that the state says puts Richard Allen squarely at the crime scene. Huge day, important day for the prosecution. And Emily, today, I mean, this is what the prosecution's been waiting to tell the jury about all along.
Yeah, about this cartridge found between the girls' bodies at the crime scene. One witness today, Bob, Melissa Oberg, the state's witness, testified for 7 hours. That speaks to the importance of her and this cartridge to the state's case. And then the defense on cross-examination questioning her, speaking to how important it is for them to attack the science of the testing that she did, that she says links this cartridge to Richard Allen's gun.
Right. You're seeing video, the woman on the left, that is Melissa Oberg, who testified for more than 7 hours today. She used to be a firearms examiner for the state of Indiana, for the state police. She was on the witness stand all day explaining how she tested a bullet cartridge that investigators found at the crime scene between Abby and Libby's bodies. Oberg told the jury how she tested a gun that police found in Allen's house while executing a search warrant. And today, the state tried to tie those two things together. Oberg told jurors how she compared the unfired bullet cartridge at the crime scene with 4 test bullets that she fired through Allen's gun in the lab, and using a powerful microscope to inspect the markings on the ammunition, she concluded the bullet and the crime scene, the bullet at the crime scene did cycle through Allen's gun. Now, this latest evidence and testimony that the jury heard today, it's the state's way to directly put Richard Allen at the murder scene. While the ballistics evidence may be compelling, the defense team tried to undercut the credibility of that evidence. During cross-examination, attorney Brad Rosie told the jury that the analysis conducted by the state is considered controversial. He also highlighted that the state's analysis was based on a bullet at the crime scene that was not fired, while the test bullets in the lab were fired. And he got Oberg to admit that her analysis and conclusions presented to the jury are subjective. So, Emily, there was a lot packed into today's testimony. It was at times, shall we say, somewhat textbook, as far as it felt like we were going back to like a college science class and what was being presented. What did you read in the jury today? Because it was a kind of a challenging day to follow along.
For all of us.
What did you see in the jury and how they took this?
I mean, I saw some of the jurors taking notes, and some were not taking notes. Some were just listening. Some had big, thick folders, and some did not. When everything was all over at the end of the day, by then you had gone, I was still there, and the jury had 13 questions for Melissa Oberg, and some that really stuck out to me. They wanted to know, did the cartridge from the crime scene come from the same lot as the bullet found in that keepsake box in Richard Allen's house that was taken during the search warrant? You remember that from yesterday. They also wanted to know, they were asking very technical questions about handling a gun, cycling a gun. They wanted to know, when you cycle a gun, do you use the same force every time? And the force that you apply, can that change the markings on the gun. Does that make a difference? And Melissa Oberg saying, you know, each time that you cycle a gun, it's not the same. You don't always use the same force. And yes, that can affect the markings that are put on it. One thing we also noted today about the jury, there was one juror missing, a man. We noticed that after lunch, and we were told from Judge Gall, we asked about that. It's an alternate, and we were told that that man had a family emergency, and that is all she said to us.
Instead of 16 jurors that we started with this morning and that we've had throughout the trial so far, this afternoon there were only 15 jurors that heard the testimony. So we don't know if that juror is being sent home and is not going to hear the rest of the testimony.
No.
And it is an alternate, we should point out.
Right.
So things were methodical today.
Yeah.
Very methodical. Yes. And this morning I'll explain a little bit about how things got started. When Melissa Oberg first took the stand about 9:15 this morning, she spent an entire hour just explaining what tool mark examination is, what that means, how that is conducted inside a lab, being able to take a look under a microscope at these tiny little marks on ammunition, and to be able to tell if bullets were fired from a certain gun, if they were cycled through a certain firearm. So she really got into details, established what tool mark analysis is, and then one of the moments that stood out to me from testimony today is she went over to a box and she did a demonstration for the jury to show them what it looks like when a bullet cycles through a gun. Because keep in mind, the bullet at the crime scene between Abby and Libby, it was a bullet cartridge. It was an unspent, an unfired bullet cartridge. And she wanted the jury to understand how a bullet cycles through. The gun that she pulled out of a box, it was the gun that belonged to Richard Allen, that they recovered from his home. And that they did this analysis on. So she cycled that for the jury. There was a video, lots of pictures, and there was a video. Basically, the jury got to take a little field trip to Germany, looking at a video that was pulled off of YouTube. We're showing that to you right now. The jury got to see how a firearm like the Sig Sauer, that firearm that was taken from Richard Allen's home, that has been linked now to the bullet casing of the crime scene. They wanted the jury to see how those types of firearms are made, from the barrel to the frame, every part of the firearm. And then they really went into frame by frame on some of the pictures that they analyzed. The jury got to see those to understand how these markings, how they were able to determine that bullet casing at the crime scene matched. So they got to see, I'll just show you, this is kind of rudimentary here, but the jury got to see pictures, and they showed the edges of the bullet casing that was found at the crime scene and the edge of a bullet that Melissa Oberg fired through Richard Allen's gun. And she showed the jury that the images that they saw, they would take the two images from those two things, and you could see that these little markings on here, from one, they would put them together and they would show how they seemed to really pretty much match up. And that is how she explained to the jury that her conclusion was that they actually, one was the same as the other, or that, I should say, that firearm that Richard Allen had in his home is the one that cycled the bullet at the crime scene. So I thought that was interesting testimony today. And you got to hear also, really the defense then push back. And the cross-examination lasted longer. It actually lasted longer than the state's presentation this morning.
Yeah, the defense really attacked the science behind this testing, the science that was used. They called it a controversial science. and they asked Melissa Oberg, they said, look, Brad Rosie, there's an ongoing debate in your industry about firearm identification as a science in its truest sense. And Melissa Oberg said, yes, there is. Brad Rosie said, there was never a time when you can say that bullet came from that gun, meaning Richard Allen's gun. And she said, I cannot say it to the exclusion of all others. They continued to push back. She also said, I can say there is sufficient agreement in the identification process. In other words, sufficient agreement. And Brad Rosie really went off after that term sufficient. And she said, look, in firearms identification, we use sufficient different than regular folks use sufficient. Sufficient in our world means enough. That is not the same as how a firearms identification expert uses.
And Brad Rosie was basically pointing out, hey, the people on the jury, the people sitting here in the courtroom, when we hear sufficient, that just means good enough, right? And she said, no, that's not what it means in her industry.
I think the biggest point, though, the defense tried to make is they said, look, when you tested Richard Allen's gun, you cycled a bullet through, you cycled a cartridge through 6 times, and then you fired a bullet out of it 4 times. And the times that it matches up, or that you say that it matches up, are the times that you fired the bullet, not that you cycled through the bullet, like the bullet at the crime scene. The bullet at the crime scene, we know, is unspent, has not been fired, has been cycled through. And Brad Rosie was pointing out and had her talk about, look, the times that it matches the most are when you fired bullets out of Richard Allen's gun, not when you cycled through.
And we heard him say to the jury during opening statements that you're basically going to hear how the state's expert who tested this gun, when they just cycled the bullet through Richard Allen's gun, which is basically the bullet at the crime scene was just cycled through.
Inconclusive.
You're going to find out that that's inconclusive, and they didn't have the information that they wanted because it didn't match. Then they went a step further and they fired it from the gun, which is not what happened to the gun.
bullet at the crime scene.
Yeah, to the bullet at the crime scene. So it was an interesting day, kind of a chess match, back and forth, Scott, that we could see playing out with the state really trying to impress on the jury just how important this was and how it's linked to Richard Allen, and then the defense saying, not so fast. There's some questions about the science that are involved.
Yeah, it's not an exact science. In the industry questions this. There are people, there are experts in your industry, in the firearms identification industry, that question this too, respected folks.
Exactly. So Scott, it was a lot of back and forth, and it'll be interesting to see what the jury makes of that and what really landed for them.
All right, Bob and Emily, we'll get back to you just in a few minutes to talk a little bit more about the testimony that came in today. We want to go ahead and bring in to the studio Katie Jackson Lindsay. She is our legal expert, a former criminal defense, former deputy prosecutor and current criminal defense attorney, and she's been with us every day of this trial that is now here at day 7. Based on what the testimony that Emily and Bob were describing, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's hard to tell how this jury is processing this evidence. We've heard a lot of really technical things today. One witness for an entire day is a lot of evidence to be delivered and a lot of evidence to be processed by one witness. But we can also really understand why they would have put this much time into this witness, because it is the piece of evidence, it is the forensic analysis that really ties Richard Allen to this crime. And so it was intentional. It was important to spend that amount of time on it, but it's hard to tell whether or not the jury is processing it and whether it's doing any good for the state, especially considering that the jury had so many questions of their own at the end of it.
If you've not been following this trial, there's been no evidence that the girls were shot. The evidence that's been presented at the jury through 1 week is that the girls' throats were slashed. And so this unspent bullet, this one that cycled through a gun that the state believes came from a gun in Richard Allen's house. So, this unspent and firing bullet and the comparison and trying to draw a conclusion, does the jury say, oh, there was a bullet found there and it somehow is connected to Richard Allen's, yes, he's guilty? Or do they say, no, that's not enough, I'm not seeing any other DNA, not seeing his clothing, not seeing some other things there?
I would think it would be really hard for the jury to find guilt just based on that one piece of evidence, because you highlighted a really good point. They're not suggesting that the method of murder in this case was a shooting. And so not only does the state have the challenge of really convincing this jury that this particular bullet was related to the gun in Richard Allen's house based on the challenges that we saw to that science, they also have to explain to this jury why that bullet is even relevant, considering that's not how the girls died. And so I don't think that the state has done that for the jury yet. So at this point, I think that they must be taking in this evidence and still saying, okay, well, you haven't met your burden.
What do you make about the defense going after how the bullets, the testing methods and that kind of thing? What's your thoughts on that?
I think it's really important to do that because with forensic science, it can be challenging for the defense, because when a jury hears from an expert, hears that they have this specialized knowledge, you just want to believe that. You want to believe that professionals in a field know what they're talking about and it's solid. And so when it's not solid and it's something that the state is really hanging their hat on, we saw Brad Rosie do exactly what he should be doing, and that is letting this jury know that, yes, this is an expert, this is a professional, but this is not foolproof science. There are studies out there that have actually challenged this, and this is something that is, at least in my experience, is not even common. In all of my experience in 16 years of trying violent crimes and trying cases that involve shootings, I've never seen this science before where they are comparing a unfired cartridge to anything, much less to a fired cartridge, to make an identification.
All right, let's bring Emily and Bob back in. So you feel like the prosecution was successful in reaching this jury, guys?
That's a really good question, Scott. Emily and I were in the courtroom, and there were times that I was sitting there trying to follow what they were saying. So I would have to imagine the jury might have been as well, because one of the things we haven't mentioned is almost all references to the ammunition and to the firearms that were in question today, they were exhibit numbers. Is how the deputy prosecutor, Jim Luttrell, he's a very experienced litigator. I was surprised that throughout hours of questioning and testimony with the witness today, he was just using, for the most part, exhibit numbers, which made things really confusing.
But the defense did the same thing on cross. They did, and that was hard to follow. Number 15, okay, is that, what is that? Is that the gun? Is it the cartridge? Is that?
It is, and the jury's going to have to kind of put all those exhibit numbers, and there's hundreds of exhibits we should point out. They're going to have to make sense of all that, but just one example. Early in the day, when they pulled out the gun to be able to cycle a bullet through the gun for the jury, when Melissa Oberg did that, it was not clear to a lot of the journalists in the room, and I'm assuming possibly to the jury, possibly to the other people in the gallery, that the actual gun they were using was Richard Allen's gun, the one that they seized from his home, because they just kept referring to it by its number. Yeah, by its exhibit number. So I thought this was just maybe a gun that they had gotten from the crime lab or something. It wasn't until much later that we understood that was actually the gun that was in Richard Allen's home.
And even more confusing, the state has one number for it, the defense has letters for it, so you're trying to follow in that way.
And throughout the day, also point out that they referenced all these exhibit numbers for a lot of other firearms that Melissa Oberg testified about testing. Lots of other bullets and bullet cartridges. So there were all of these different. One of the reasons it got confusing is because they kept introducing all these other pieces of ammunition and firearms that we didn't really. They never did explain where they came from.
Well, Melissa Oberg talked about they tested one gun, I think it was a Glock, 2 days after, February 17th. She said that was, they ruled that out right away, right? Because it's a right? Different caliber. And then a few days later, they tested 2 more guns. And then some years later, in August of 2022, they pulled some guns from the river.
Yes.
that was part of this investigation.
And they didn't explain to the jury why they were introducing. Now these are other pieces of ammunition and other firearms that in one way or another they were testing as part of this case.
Right.
But in the jury's mind now, I mean, you're just tracking all these exhibit numbers, all these other
different guns, and
they really never came back and explained what those were. Yeah, so I thought that was confusing, and also perhaps the most confusing thing to me is Jim Luttrell never came back and did a summary for the jury to explain what they had just heard from their star witness. Specifically, when he asked Melissa Oberg, what is your conclusion? And let's put this quote up on the screen for our viewers to see. He said, what's your conclusion? And she said, my conclusion is I identified 314 as having cycled cartridge item 16. Now, there's another way that you could have said that, or that the deputy prosecutor could have summarized for the jury what they just heard. That could have been what you just heard.
What you just told us.
Yeah, what you just heard,
really just
members of the jury, is that the bullet cartridge at the crime scene cycled through
Richard Allen's
gun. But they didn't say that. And actually, Scott, I'm curious to send it back to you for a moment, and Katie, to find out if that surprises her as well, and what a jury would actually make of something like that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So let's go ahead and ask Katie. Does that feel like a missed opportunity that they didn't summarize and link, hey, this came from Richard Allen's gun?
It does seem like a missed opportunity, and that quote that we saw, to a certain extent, is just sort of ineffective lawyering. And I say that, but I want to give some grace to these lawyers, because here's how that kind of plays out. So when the crime lab or a forensic scientist like Melissa Oberg gets these items, she gets them by item number. She may have a brief description, but she won't know the intimate details of where that item came from or anything that the jury has already learned about that item. She's isolated to that item number. However, the attorneys do know that. And while they can't necessarily come back in the middle of testimony and give a summary to the jury, there's an effective way to ask the questions so that the jury can connect item 16 to that fired bullet. So, for example, the prosecutor couldn't have necessarily said, well, now, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard A, B, and C, because that would have been him testifying, and that would have been objectionable. But at the end of the day, it is his responsibility to make sure that the jury understands what they are hearing. So an effective way that you often see trial lawyers do that is to say, your item 16 is my fired bullet from the crime scene. Would you agree with that description, Ms. Oberg? And she would look at her report and say yes. And so to not do that is absolutely a missed opportunity, because if they're on item 314, they've heard about over 300 pieces of evidence, and you can't expect a jury to keep up with those evidence numbers.
Yeah, Bob and Emily, this has certainly been a long week, so much information. This case is going to continue on Saturday. What's still to come?
Well, Scott, we know that there are really three key items that the prosecution wants to present to the jury.
Right.
Three of those. So far, we've heard two of them, right?
Two. One today, that cartridge found between the girls' bodies, and then earlier this week, those four witnesses that say that they placed Richard Allen at the trail that day during the state's timeline of when these murders occurred. The one thing that we haven't heard yet so far are those 60 plus alleged confessions made by Richard Allen while he was in prison being, awaiting this trial. And it's, there's potential that we might be hearing those alleged confessions in his own words, in his own voice. Now, tomorrow is a short day here, 9 to noon. It's hard to imagine that they're gonna start down that road tomorrow on a short day.
I agree with you. It's possible. At the same time, it's possible if you want to leave the jurors over this weekend. They've got a day and a half off, Saturday afternoon and Sunday. Do you want to
give them something to contemplate,
something to think about? Do you want them actually hearing Richard Allen's voice confessing to these crimes as something to just kind of stew on over the weekend.
Right.
I don't know how the prosecution's going to handle that, but I agree with you. That might be something that they want to hold off until early next week.
And of course, we know that the defense is going to push back against those alleged confessions, saying, look, he made those while he was under severe mental duress from
Yes.
solitary confinement that went on too long.
Yeah.
So.
A long day, a technical day of testimony. Again, we're seeing how all these pieces of the state's case are starting to fit together right now that they're presenting to the jury. We've been able to be in the courtroom every day of this trial so far. Our plan is to continue being
Keep on.
right here until we have a verdict. Still a long way to go until we get to that point, but it's been a fascinating week
It really has.
as the sun sets on day 7 here in Delphi. Scott and Katie, we're going to send it back to you guys.
Before you go, I do have one question about the witnesses that we heard earlier in the week. Again, for people who may not have been following the case real closely, didn't some of those witnesses who spotted Bridge Guy, weren't they describing a much different looking person than the suspect, Richard Allen?
Yes.
Yes, they did. So we
word.
talked about possible missed opportunities today for the prosecution as far as how they presented the case involving this unspent bullet casing at the crime scene. It's very possible that there were some missed opportunities earlier this week because, again, all 4 of the witnesses who testified, there were inconsistencies with the story that they presented to the jury compared to how they recalled Bridge Guy looking
Right.
when they called this in back in 2017, right after the murders took place, describing him
Blonde,
as
fluffy hair.
having brown
Fluffy hair. Excuse
brown
me.
poofy hair.
Brown poofy hair. There we go. Get it right. I gotta get it right.
Being muscular, being tall, young, and in 20s or 30s. Obviously, a lot of those things don't necessarily describe the way
Allen.
that Richard Allen looks. So, I'd say of the 2 points, the 2 really important points that the state has had to make so far on the witnesses placing Richard Allen on the trails and claiming that he's the Bridge Guy that they saw, and then today on the bullet casings, I would say that's probably a couple of missed opportunities so far. So I think that the testimony as far as the confessions is going to be really key, and that's what we're expecting to come up next.
All right, Bob and Emily, great job there up in Carroll County at the Delphi case. Thank you for covering it. We know you'll continue covering it until we do get a verdict. Let's bring Katie back in and talk about not only what we saw today, but what we've seen in the first 7 days and what's to come perhaps as early as tomorrow. So again, as they mentioned, there were 60 reported alleged confessions by Richard Allen while he was incarcerated waiting for this trial to take place, including a note that was reportedly written to the warden saying, I want to confess, and I want to talk to the family and offer my apologies. And there are apparently, allegedly, 60 of these confessions. What kind of impact might that have to spell out however many the state wants to put out there saying that Richard Allen has confessed to these murders?
Well, in any scenario, in any murder case, in any crime, a confession by the defendant is really hard to overcome for a defense team. So that evidence should bring big gains for the state. We've talked about how they said they had 3 big things, the cartridges. Well, that didn't go so well for them today once the expert was cross-examined. The witnesses that saw him out there, well, we now know that all of those descriptions are inconsistent with Richard Allen's appearance and inconsistent with each other. And so when you think about those 3 big things, the last thing that they have is those confessions. And like I said, having a defendant himself tell you that he committed a crime, it's really hard for the jury to disagree with that. And so that's going to be really difficult evidence for the defense. I think we'll see them hanging their hat a lot in cross-examination on those conditions of the prison, and then we'll probably later on see some more challenges to that from their case. But that should be big gains for the state.
Okay, I also want to kind of look down the road here a little bit. So if after the confessions are done, and depending on what else they may be introducing, The defense then, of course, is going to, give the case, and they've talked about having maybe as many as 100 witnesses that they may put on the stand. And we're just through week one here, and we haven't even gotten to the defense case. Do you think that we see Richard Allen take the witness stand and testify in his own defense?
I would think not, for a number of reasons. One, you are going to hear from Richard Allen through those confessions. Then you're going to hear his lawyers challenge those confessions through cross and through their experts. And so his story is sort of being told through that process, because by challenging those confessions, his lawyers are putting out there that he's saying, I didn't do it, right? Because just as much as they have the confessions, you can't discount his earlier statements where he said, I didn't do it. And so in a criminal trial, sometimes the most that a defendant can say is, I didn't do it. They might be able to say, I wasn't there, I had an alibi, but we now know that Richard Allen put himself there. This whole thing blew open based on a tip that he called in himself. So when you think about it in the greater context of all the evidence that we've heard, they probably won't need to do that, because they are developing Richard Allen's story and what he would say through cross-examining state's witnesses, and I think we'll see a little more of that through the defense witnesses.
Well, it's been a fascinating first week. We thank you so much for joining us here on WTHR+. We're going to continue to break down the Delphi murders trial every weeknight at 10 o'clock here on WTHR+. You can also find our ongoing coverage, including detailed reports of each day of this big trial, just by going to WTHR.com/Delphi. Thanks for joining us.